Good morning and welcome to the Deanery Garden at Canterbury Cathedral on this morning of Wednesday the 6th of October as we gather for our morning prayers. Wherever you are in the world, feel welcome. It is this morning a dry morning, but there's a really cold wind, and it certainly changed this equinoctial time of year, as we've said, keeps changing the weather. And so we are sitting here in the working heart of the garden. The cold frames here are open, but only during the day, for little potted plants here need protection at night. And as it gets colder and colder, that protection will be all the more necessary. Behind me are plants that are still out at the moment. There's a tropical hibiscus, there are some coral trees here. There's even a few flowers on the jasmine, and above it the olive tree, but the potted plants here will go soon inside the greenhouse again so that they are protected from this chilly wind. Oddly, it's a west wind, and John Masefield says in his poem it's a warm wind, the west wind, full of birds' cries. Well, this morning it may be full of birds' cries and seagulls' cries from time to time, but it's certainly not a warm wind. It is freezing cold, and a very, very big change in temperature. As we begin our prayers on this particular morning in the greenhouse yard, where the work of the garden goes on in preparation for the winter, and all the pots of little plants here are being sheltered. There's a particularity of all these plots, which will eventually, of course, be planted out, but for the moment they are in here being protected. And someone else is wanting a little bit of warmth here on my lap this morning. Let's begin our prayers. Bring your concerns from across the world this morning. O Lord, open our lips, and our mouth shall proclaim your praise. May Christ, the true, the only light, banish all darkness from our hearts and minds. Blessed are you, Creator of all. To you be praise and glory forever. As your dawn renews the face of the earth, bringing light and life to all creation, may we rejoice in this day you have made, and as we wake refreshed from the depths of sleep, open our eyes to behold your presence, and strengthen our hands to do your will, that the world may rejoice and give you praise. Blessed be God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Blessed be God forever. The night has passed, and the day lies open before us. Let us pray with one heart and mind. And as we rejoice in the gift of this new day, so may the light of your presence, O God, set our hearts on fire with love for you, now and forever. Amen. Our psalm on this morning of the month, this sixth morning, is Psalm 30. I will exalt you, O Lord, because you have raised me up, and have not let my foes triumph over me. O Lord my God, I cried out to you, and you have healed me. You brought me up, O Lord, from the dead. You restored me to life from among those that go down to the pit. Sing to the Lord, you servants of his. Give thanks to his holy name. For his wrath endures but the twinkling of an eye, his favour for a lifetime. Heaviness may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. In my prosperity, I said, I shall never be moved. You, Lord, of your goodness, have made my hills so strong. And then you hid your face from me, and I was utterly dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cried. To the Lord I made my supplication. What profit is there in my blood if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you or declare your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and have mercy upon me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have put off my sackcloth and girded me with gladness. Therefore, my heart sings to you without ceasing. O Lord my God, I will give you thanks forever. So we turn to our reading, not from Genesis today. We've turned the page and skipped as we said yesterday, 430 years. A whole age of history until we get to the first chapter of the book of Exodus. In the Bible, just the turning of a page, and in human time, an enormous length of time. So that a sweep of history. And now we're going to narrow down into particularity. The particularity of humankind, and then human individuals, and the particularity of human decision making. It's just as we can see the sweep of a landscape, or then come into the garden and see the sweep of the whole garden, and sometimes long shots across, and then now here we are with tiny plants in little pots, each showing a particularity with their leaves as the cold frames are open so that they get fresh air, but ready to protect because they need that from the atmosphere. Here's the book of Exodus beginning. We're going to read chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now, there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. If it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. This is a cruel story. It's a particular story, but if you like, with the selective killing of the boys, you see the first Holocaust. and the way in which the exiles are now being selectively killed. Every boy being born thrown into the Nile because of the decision of the Egyptian king at that time. Now, see what we've done. We've come from that great sweep of history down to the little resume of all that went on with the brothers of Joseph, who are named, and then it says that they and their generations died, and no mention is made of a time, but we get to a time when the Israelite people are so strong that they begin to threaten, in terms of their numbers and strength, those in Egypt. And therefore really, really harsh measures begin to be taken. There's then the particularity of even human beings. We've now narrowed right down so that even the midwives are named now, and we're in a particular human scene. And at first it's a scene which we smile at, because the midwives tell this simple lie. Well, of course the Israelite women are so strong, they tend to give birth before the midwives arrive, and then the picture turns to complete horror, because the Pharaoh's having nothing of that. He then orders that every time a boy is born to the Israelite nation, the baby boy will be thrown into the River Nile and killed. And this selective way that he's working at the moment to try and limit the amount of the Israelite nation, that can't go on, because his workforce, which he is using now in slavery, building cities for him and being given hard and bitter labor, and that workforce is important to him. This is the story of the first chapter of Exodus. It's covered an enormous amount of ground, but it's made the exile, which had been a willing exile at the time of Joseph's family coming down so that they might be fed and resourced in the years of famine, a willing exile and a joyful exile, into something which is now hard and bitter and cruel tyranny, where babies are being slaughtered so that the population will not grow too big to frighten and give a danger to Pharaoh's people. Exodus has a very different atmosphere than the end of Genesis. And we think of the different human situations, how history can change at a moment's notice. You might think in the way in which Afghanistan changed in a moment to a completely different atmosphere, in the way we're thinking about it now than we were thinking about it, 6 months ago, or something of that sort. But here we have a sweep of human history and then a piece of particularity. And we tend to do this in our morning worship. We think of general situations of joy or of sorrow, general situations across the world, general situations of the pandemic, and then focus on a particular date or a particular situation which a small group of humankind are facing. It's the way in which we tend to be. But it's the human story of particular people that stays in the mind and then shines a light on the more general. Well, today, strangely and coincidentally, in 1536, the translator of the Scriptures, William Tyndale, was martyred. He's someone who appears in our calendar, and he died a cruel death, first strangled and then burned at the stake. And he had been the translator of the Scriptures. He didn't complete the whole Bible, and as we saw a few days ago, Miles Coverdale finished that Bible off and was able then to produce in 1535 a complete Bible. And the way in which he used Tyndale to complete that Bible, Tyndale himself was a much more skilled translator of languages from the Greek and from the Hebrew, but his Old Testament was never finished. So Coverdale relied hugely on Tyndale's translation, as he himself produced the first complete English Bible in 1535, which was then given royal approval in 1537. Tyndale, meanwhile, was martyred in this year, in the year 1536, on this day, October the 6th, a cruel death. In fact, in honouring him as a translator of the Scriptures, we can think in two ways which join two of our cathedrals together. Our own cathedral, and as you saw, we have a sequence of Bibles from different translators for the Bible translated into languages that people could understand. First of all, we have a Vulgate, the Vulgata, that Jerome translated. And so if we think of that one first, going through 5 different translations, and then after that there's a Tyndale Bible, such as it is, and then the Bible of Miles Coverdale, and then the Great Bible, which was actually resting on the translations of Tyndale and Coverdale, which was authorized by King Henry VIII to be put into churches, every parish church, so that parishioners would have a chance to read the Scriptures, if they could, for themselves, or have them read to them in their own vernacular language. That was an enormous step forward. Tyndale was not martyred in England because of his translation of the Scriptures. He had fled from England because he'd made the king cross, because from his reading of the Scriptures he opposed King Henry divorcing his wife. He said that that is not proper for the king to do, and that angered the king in a great way. We have great sympathy with Henry VIII because he was so concerned that the stability of the realm should be continued. His own father, Henry VII, had brought stability. Henry VIII, whose brother had died, and Henry became king, and Henry VIII desperately wanted stability. But in those days he saw that as necessary because of having a male heir. And he didn't have a male heir. As you know, he had Princess Mary from Catherine of Aragon. But then he desperately wanted a male heir. And then, of course, Anne Boleyn gave him Elizabeth I, who was to prove as strong and wonderful a monarch, if not better, than Henry VIII. But at that time still, he desperately wanted a male heir. And for the stability of the nation, he wanted that. So Tyndale angered him. Tyndale fled abroad, but then fell into the hands of the Emperor Charles V, who very much disapproved of translating the Latin Bible into the language of the various people. Tyndale has said he said, I want every ploughboy to know the Bible better than you priests, as he was speaking to the English clergy at the time. And he was speaking to a section of the English clergy who had proved themselves not very well educated, and certainly not really able to read the Bible with understanding in Latin, just reading it by rote. So that was a statement of his to the English clergy, but as he went abroad, he fell into the hands of Charles V, and hence his martyrdom this day. We have then those Bibles going through in the library, in the archive here, but also in our sister cathedral of Washington National Cathedral in the United States, the Canterbury pulpit, the main pulpit of that cathedral, which was carved here in stones from Canterbury Cathedral and sent across as a gift, has on it 3 panels of people who were significant in the development of the English Church and the Anglican Episcopal strand, which that cathedral belongs to, as we do here. And of course on the front, as we've probably said before, is the picture of Stephen Langton, the Archbishop who's buried here, who caused King John to seal the Magna Carta. And then on one side of it you have the Venerable Bede translating the Scriptures at that time, and on the other side of it the martyrdom of William Tyndale, which we remember today. And around are statues of those who later, rather like Lancelot Andrewes, who translated in, let me mention the 5th Bible now, the King James Bible, which was translated and then published in 1611 after the Tudor times, in Stuart times, from the best scholarship. And that Bible, the 1611 Bible, became the English Bible for centuries, really, and is still valued for its beautiful 17th century language. So many different types of Bibles, but what we have around the pulpit in Washington National Cathedral is the intention of people to translate it so people could read it. Lancelot Andrews or Brooke Foss Westcott, or who translating on to the Revised Bible, so that people have it in their own language and can read the stories as we do and ponder them and have them explained to them. We remember him, Tyndale, today, martyred on this day in 1536. On this day also, in 1892, the poet laureate, Alfred Lord Tennyson, great symbol of the Victorian age, of the 19th century in this particular culture. He was 83 when he died, and so many of his poems are very well known, and we've quoted some of them in the past. I remember sitting on the side of the pool as the Lilly closed just behind me here, and quoting first the Lady of Shalott, that lovely poem where Lancelot and Tennyson, of course, madly keen on the Arthurian legends as so much a strand of the culture of this nation. But it was that little poem also about the now sleeps the crimson petal, now the white, and now folds the lily in the porphyry font, as the water lily closed. And it was Compline on a Sunday evening when we read that. But and we've also read the bit from Ulysses. We were talking about James Bond yesterday, and when Judi Dench is killed as M at the end of Skyfall, she quotes before she dies Tennyson's Ulysses about old age and gifts that are left. But this morning I wanted to look at one of his longest poems. I'm not going to read it, the long poem, In Memoriam, which was brought forth from him because of grief at the death of a friend he loved so well, Arthur Hallam. And this poem developed as part of his dealing with that grief. There is, at the very beginning of it, but the prologue I think was written some years later, a section of the poem which we use as a hymn sometimes, and it's certainly in the school hymn book that I sometimes quote from, Songs of Praise. But here it is. Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face, by faith and faith alone embrace, believing where we cannot prove. Thine are these orbs of light and shade, thou madest life in man and brute, thou madest death, and lo, thy foot is on the skull which thou hast made. Thou wilt not leave us in the dust. Thou madest man, he knows not why. He thinks he was not made to die, and thou hast made him. Thou art just. Thou seemest human and divine, the highest, holiest manhood thou. Our wills are ours, we know not how. Our wills are ours, to make them thine. Our little systems have their day. They have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they. We have but faith. We cannot know, for knowledge is of things we see, and yet we trust it comes from thee. A beam in darkness let it grow. Forgive my grief for one removed, thy creature, whom I found so fair. I trust he lives in thee, and there I find him worthier to be loved. Forgive these wild and wandering cries, confusions of a wasted youth. Forgive them where they fail in truth, and in thy wisdom make me wise. Well, the poem goes on. It's split into so many sections. It's a very long poem. But there is one section that I'm very fond of, I'm fond of it because it's set to music, and I was talking the other day about Sir Malcolm Sargent and his conducting of Christmas concerts with the Royal Choral Society in the Royal Albert Hall. And the last one I ever heard him conduct, the great anthem, Ring Out Wild Bells, which is really a New Year anthem, was performed by him with the whole choral society, the massive orchestra, and also the tubular bells ringing out the wild bells. And Tennyson, that's from Tennyson's poem, this very poem, which talks about how each new year we try to ring out the old and ring in the new. Here's that section of Tennyson's poem, which is not musical this morning, it's simply poetry. But that anthem is one of a great favourite of mine. Ring out wild bells to the wild sky, the flying cloud, the frosty light. The year is dying in the night. Ring out wild bells and let him die. Ring out the old, ring in the new, ring happy bells across the snow. The year is going, let him go. Ring out the false, ring in the true. Ring out the grief that saps the mind for those that here we see no more. Ring out the feud of rich and poor. Ring in redress to all mankind. Ring out a slowly dying cause and ancient forms of party strife. Ring in the nobler modes of life with sweeter manners, purer laws. Ring out the want, the care, the sin, the faithless coldness of the times. Ring out my mournful rhymes, but ring the fuller minstrel in. Ring out false pride in place and blood, the civic slander and the spite. Ring in the love of truth and right. Ring in the common love of good. Ring out old shapes of foul disease. Ring out the narrowing lust of gold. Ring out the 1,000 wars of old. Ring in the 1,000 years of peace. Ring in the valiant man and free, the larger heart, the kindlier hand. Ring out the darkness of the land. Ring in the Christ that is to be. A reflective Tennyson on this day of his year's mind in 1892. And then I wanted to mention also the pre-Raphaelite painter who took inspiration from Tennyson, as so many of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood did, Ford Madox Brown, died on the 6th of October in 1893, and his paintings, very realistic paintings in wonderful colour, are quite well known to so many of you. And when you see them, you think, oh yes, was that Ford Madox Brown? One of his biggest and the longest he took to paint was simply a scene of work in Hampstead in the 1860s. And it's really a set of strong workmen digging up the road to prepare for something else. And then other people of, shall we call it, Victorian society at all levels, standing around watching in different ways, so that you have a kaleidoscope of society at that time in 1860. There are the tools, just as the gardening tools are here with us today, particular tools that the workmen are using. Strong men being physical and on the side, to older men sitting on a wall and chatting and reflecting on the strength of the younger ones, which they no longer have. Some very smart ladies walking along, but another person bearing a basket of flowers, which she is going to sell. There are children who are delighting in the work that's going on. There are dogs. There are always dogs in Ford's painting. And at the same time, at the back, there are affluent houses of that particular time, which would have been new at the time as Hampstead was developing. It's simply a snapshot, but it's full of particularity of that culture at that time and those faces. And the pre-Raphaelites always painted in a very real way. There are two biblical pictures of his that I absolutely love, and one of them is called Jacob and Joseph's Coat. There is Jacob in all his desperate grief and horror, And there are the brothers showing him the coat, and their faces are giving away their deceit. I think Jacob is too grief-stricken to notice. And around again is the scene of the affluent household of Jacob, and the brothers who are obviously explaining, yes, we found this, and the coat is torn, the beautiful coat is torn, and there's blood stains, and there's the dog always. The dog is sniffing the blood stains. Very realistic picture. But at the same time, probably the most moving painting of the scriptures of all is Jesus washing Peter's feet, kneeling at Peter's feet, and Peter looking down at Jesus. Jesus in a posture of extreme humility before Peter, and around the table, the supper table, the other disciples leaning forward, and their faces so like the faces of the workmen in the pictures of work, showing them to be really real and particular characters in the imagination of Ford Madox Brown. I give thanks for images like that because of the particularity of humankind in those pictures. Well, those paintings we can actually now go to a different date, and this isn't a painting at all. It was actually a scene of horror on this day in October the 6th, 1981, when the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat, who had received a Nobel Peace Prize with Menachem Begin in 1978 for the peace accord between Egypt and Israel, was assassinated by his own army officers in the middle of a military parade as he sat watching it. Everything completely took the Egyptian nation by surprise, and the president was assassinated by people who disagreed with his action of creating a peace treaty. That was on this day in 1981, October the 6th. On October the 7th, I remember flying into Cairo on my way to Khartoum, and the plane stopped there. There was such disorder in Egypt that we were hustled off the plane and our passports taken away, and we were motored into the middle of Cairo and put in a hotel. And as we went through the streets of Cairo, troops were lining the roads, but we were aware of a nation absolutely in confusion, not knowing at all what had happened. And I was thinking, well, now what's going to happen? I have no passport. Here I am on my way to Khartoum, but the plane has been stopped, and we're in the middle of a scene of complete confusion. 3 days before, it would have been a civilized city of Cairo with all the order that one expected there. Now it was a nation in confusion. And I remember those 24 hours really well. I remember the next morning sitting in the hotel lobby, and next to me was a quite elderly professor of Greek who was on his way to give a lecture and was on this particular plane, and he was sitting next to me, and he had in his pockets and in his coat all he needed to continue his study, and sat quite quietly and was quite comforting to me, and would say words of encouragement and saying, please don't worry, it will all work out, and then go on with his work. And he was sifting through ages old documents and just carrying on quietly with his studies in the middle of that. But it also taught me always to travel around with a notebook and the way to write, and maybe a book to read or something of that sort, because then at any time one can sit and reflect and talk to the people around and give encouragement. I learned lessons like that in traveling in those ways, when transport actually only ever arrived when it got there. And true enough, in the afternoon of that day, we were put back into vehicles and taken back to the airport, and there was someone standing with our pile of passports, and they'd held them up and shouted the names until eventually my name came. Passport was returned, and we were put back onto a plane which flew on then to Khartoum. And I was thinking all the way there, being nervous, I wonder if the people there would have waited for me. We are actually so late. But I was really mistrustful in those days, and I learned it well afterwards, really very well. If you're a guest in cultures like that, people never let you down when you arrive. They would have been waiting and waiting and waiting and gather you into their household, so that night I was in the garden of the Bishop of Omdurman on the other side of the River Nile from Khartoum, and in total safety as we shared a meal together, and a bed was set for me with a good mosquito net over it in the garden because of the heat. So a memory, from my own past, and I revised my memory this morning because of a notebook that I kept at the time. My Sudan notebooks are full of little stories of that sort. Right, let's say our prayers on this particular morning, giving thanks, shall we say, for particularity, which is such an aspect of our life. Little things which remind us, and all the time I've been speaking, you'll be reminded of incidents in your own life, of particularity. On this chilly morning here, but the sun is shining directly on me now, so I've got a bit more warmth. This day we're remembering the Anglican Church in Kenya, and we give thanks for the church there and pray for it. And in our own diocese, as I said yesterday, we're being asked to reflect on what the harvest means in our own areas of life and how we share that harvest. So we pray for Justin, our Archbishop, and also for Rose, Bishop of Dover, and Emma, Bishop at Lambeth, as we say our prayer this morning and give thanks for translators of the Scriptures. This is the collect for this week. Bring your own intentions and prayers. Almighty and everlasting God, increase in us your gift of faith, that forsaking what lies behind and reaching out to that which is before, we may run the way of your commandments and win the crown of everlasting joy through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So we say each in our own language the prayer our Saviour taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, for ever and ever. Amen. Moment of silence now for your own prayers. The peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be upon you, upon those whom you love, and those whom you would pray for, today and always. Amen. So we give thanks for the translation of the Scriptures. We give thanks also that some languages, rather like the Latin, when Jerome was translating, was a language which was spoken by a great number of people right across Europe. Before that, in the Eastern time, the Koine Greek, the common Greek, was the same. And then the translations open up, and the English translations we have, which are absolutely manifold and many at this time, and many people across the world speak English because really they watch American films, and also scholars tend to communicate in English in so many different ways. But at the same time, there are many other languages which are huge in their perception And it's wonderful going to services in those languages, because there, when you're not understanding a word, the shape of the liturgy itself is a different kind of order. And you think, now this must be the Sanctus, or this is the Agnus Dei, and I'm still in my mind speaking those Latin words. So language tends to feed into one translation after another. And it's a lovely thing to check one translation from another, which we can do over the way in which we're given those translations, and search engines can do it as well for us. As we say, can we see what that verse is in the King James Bible, or can we see what that verse is in the Tyndale Bible, or how did it look in the Latin, or something of that sort. And that is a great privilege for us in this generation as we go on. I've got a splendid thing to do tonight, a nice thing to do tonight. The Great Mungeon Horticultural Society have asked me to go and speak to them about the way we've used the garden day by day in this time of pandemic and lockdown. And I shall be really glad to be sharing the evening with them. They will give me much horticultural knowledge, and I will show how we have shown, Fletcher and I, the garden of the deanery and the various plants and spaces to reflect the scriptures day by day. So think of me there. It means I shan't be at evensong, so I'll say that privately by myself on the way there. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll find below two links you can click on. One is the anthem that I was speaking of Tennyson's words, Ring Out Wild Bells by Percy Fletcher. The other is an adaptation in different music of the same words, sung by the Donavar Fellowship and Community in southern India, by the brothers and sisters of the community and the children of the community, and a very charming adaptation of those same words, showing how words can be adapted to the music of any culture. You'll also see information about the fellowship itself and the work it does in South India.